Hello, this is Franklyn McInnis. The majority of the videos on my YouTube channel, they focus on Funko Pops and other collectibles because that's something I've been very much into for the past couple of months. I also on my channel share some of my poetry. In fact, every Wednesday I try to post a poem. But this video is something that is very different, so if you're looking for anything related to collectibles, this video I'll just let you know is not for you. But if you are somebody who is interested in writing, whether it be poetry or writing novels, then that is the main focus of this video. This is actually one of the first videos that I wanted to create on my channel, and I just got sidetracked because I was so focused on collectibles and things like that. But I'm really making this video so that people that are curious about my writing process and people that are serious about getting into writing, they can see my suggestions and maybe this will work for you as well. I'm just going to very briefly touch on poetry because I really don't think there's a lot to say about poetry. Poetry is a very open, very interpretive art form, so I just don't think that there's any set rules to it. But these are just a few of my suggestions. First of all, always keep a notebook handy and write a little each day. I did not become a poet overnight. It took a long time. In fact, I still have some of my old notebooks from high school, and I look back at some of those poems that even though some people liked them back then, I can be honest with myself and say that they were weak in a lot of ways. I was still finding my voice. So it took me a long time to really become comfortable with poetry. And again, the main way that I did that is by writing just a little bit each day. Secondly, here, make sure that you focus on free verse poetry. That means don't worry about rhyming, don't worry about matching syllables and keeping things consistent line to line, things like that. Just write what you feel. Okay, and that goes right into the next thing here. It says focus on your personal feelings, find inspiration in your experiences in daily life. That's all you need to do is just write down your thoughts. Poetry is very simple. It doesn't have to sound like a certain type of work. It doesn't have to sound like somebody else's work. In fact, your poetry should stand apart from other people's. And the next thing here says, don't try to sound poetic. Some of the worst poetry I've ever heard is when people rhyme just for the sake of rhyming. They rhyme together words that don't even make sense. They have these very grandiose sounding lines that don't have real meaning to them. There's no substance there. I would rather read a simple poem that is clear and concise than read something that sounds fancy but has no real meaning to it. So again, don't try to sound poetic. Just get your feelings across. Next here it says, realize that it may take months or years to find your voice and your style. Like I said, it took me a very long time to find my style and to become comfortable with writing and to get to that point where I can sit down and knock out a poem in maybe 15 or 20 minutes. That takes a long time. So just be patient with it and write constantly. Even when I was in the military, I did 3 years in the Army right out of high school. Even then, I would still keep a little notebook with me and I would still write. In fact, there were fellow soldiers that sometimes asked me to write poems so they could send a little something home to their girlfriend. So basically, I was playing Cyrano there. Okay, so always find that time to keep writing and just keep it going. And then lastly here, and I do think this is pretty important, as far as your poetry is concerned, get feedback from non-poets. The reason that I'm saying that is I'm going to be just completely blunt about this. I have dealt with poetry groups online. I've dealt with other poets, face to face and things like that. And there are some poets out there that are pretty cool and they're easy to get along with. But then you also run into a lot of poets that are very high and mighty, very arrogant. They act like their words are saving the world. They act like they're making a difference when really all they do is share their poems with other poets. So that's not making a difference to me. So again, if you want feedback, share your work with people that are not poets, and I think you're going to get a more honest feedback. Because look at it this way: if you're sharing your work with other poets, if your work is just not up to par, then they could be kind of condescending to you, or they may just kind of try to humor you or whatever, or just straight up put you down, which is really gonna mess with your confidence. But at the same time, if your work is really good, then you have those poets that may basically hate on your work, that may act jealous, and then still try to put you down. So it's almost a lose-lose situation when you share with a lot of other poets. But that's all I'm going to say about poetry. That's really not the main focus here. I'll just say poetry, I think, is simple. I do think anybody can do it. I'm not saying anybody can do it well, but I do think that anybody can write poems. Let's keep it moving here. So the rest of this presentation, the main thing I want to focus on is novel writing. And I have written quite a few novels over the years. I used to self-publish through a small company in North Carolina, but unfortunately they went out of business, so I don't do hard copies anymore. I just do ebooks. And I have written quite a few novels and also quite a few poetry collections. I tend not to tell people how many because some people just don't believe me, but trust me, I've done a lot of writing since I've been serious about writing, which has basically been for, I would say, the past 12 years or so that I've really been serious about writing. So let's get into my process for novel writing. First of all here, I have to stress, be willing to do the work. Novels don't write themselves. You can talk about an idea for a novel for months, for years, but if you're not sitting down and doing the work, it's just not going to happen. I kind of look at it like basically that stoner mentality. You know, potheads, they have great ideas that will just never come to life. That's sort of the mentality that I hear with a lot of writers, or so-called writers, or wannabe writers. They just talk and talk and talk about their ideas, but they don't put in the work. So be willing to do the work and realize that, yes, it is work. As far as a concept is concerned, basically inspiration can come from different places, but this is my first suggestion though. I think the safest genre to focus on is realistic fiction. Realistic fiction. So that's a story that's made up to an extent. It may be based off of some real experiences, but for the most part, you're dealing with fictional characters, a fictional town maybe, and and so on. But it's something that could happen in real life. When you think about other genres, even if it's science fiction or a western or horror, whatever it may be, they may seem like they could be simple because you're just making things up, but then they actually, once you get into them, you might realize they do require some research. And then also you want to be very careful that you're not doing anything that's too similar to what's already out there. In fact, some of the first novels that I wrote, it was very much comic book influenced, and I never actually shared those writings with anybody except for maybe 2 or 3 people. But a lot of those ideas, I've seen them in other places, and then I realized that some of my ideas had basically been used before. So you kind of get into dangerous territory when you do venture into sci-fi and those other places. So I would say realistic fiction is a good route to go. Okay, and next here it says, even if your idea comes from a real life experience, make sure that you ask yourself, what value will it have for readers? I hear a lot of people, they talk about something crazy that happened to them and they say, oh, this would make a great book. But still, what is the story? You can't just take a crazy thing that's happened in your life and assume that's going to actually make a great story and be interesting to a reader. It has to have some value. And when I say value, that means that it has to have a theme. What is the life lesson that people are going to take away from your story? A lot of biographies and biopics, they get criticized because people say, oh, it's not completely accurate. Well, they can't be completely accurate because even if it's biographical, you still have to shape it in order to make sure that it has a theme that the audience can walk away with a message there. Otherwise, there's just no point to it. So just keep that in mind. Even though it may be interesting to you, doesn't mean that it's going to have value for a reader unless you shape it to have some value. Also here next it says, if it's your first novel, don't try anything too grand. Keep your time frame short and also keep your cast of characters small. Don't add in a whole bunch of characters that aren't really there for a good purpose. And again, even if it's based on a real life situation, you don't have to try to include everybody who was there. Just focus on the most important people. And I would say, I think 3 is a really good number to work with, especially if you're talking about main characters. I would not go beyond 3 because usually once you go beyond 3, then you're starting to run into that situation where you have characters that seem a little too similar to each other. So 3 is usually a good number, but I would mainly say focus on one particular main character, and again, keep that time frame short. It's good if your story takes place in just a couple of days, couple of weeks, and maybe even just one day if possible. Try to keep the time frame short, and that's going to help to keep things focused. And make sure you consider where the story will lead to and where it will end. You could have a great story, but if that ending is not on point, then it was all for nothing. Next up here with pre-writing, you have to do an outline. I can't stress this enough. You have to do an outline. I've seen so many people that jumped into writing novels and then they started to ramble, or they wrote themselves in the corners and they couldn't quite work things out. So an outline is absolutely a necessity. First of all, don't get hung up on the title. That's not important. You can change it later on. And to me, a title is just not a big deal. And that's really all I have to say about that. Next, you should be able to sum up your concept in just 1 or 2 sentences, especially if you plan on trying to get published one day, officially published. You better be able to sum up your concept in just 1 or 2 sentences. Also, make sure that you briefly describe the main setting. It doesn't have to be super detailed, and I will show you an example of this in a moment here. Next here it says, consider what characters will be needed and list them. And again, this is my own personal process. This is what I like to do. And it says here, if you have trouble creating names, which is something I struggle with, use web searches such as list of baby names. I know that sounds silly, but that's where I tend to get names from, because I'm not so great at coming up with names that sound natural to me. So I actually will look up lists like baby names just to get some ideas. And along with your characters, consider their appearance, but don't get super detailed about that, because when it comes down to it, readers are more than likely, they're going to picture somebody that they're familiar with. That just makes it easier for them. So don't get too concerned about appearance. Focus more on character traits, quirks that they may have, and their relation to the narrative. Another little tip here, something I like to do sometimes, if I'm having trouble picturing a character, then I may literally in my outline, once I've typed up my outline, I literally will go back and put in pictures of actors or celebrities that I can see playing that role. Okay, and that really helps me out to make the character feel more real. And lastly here, don't even attempt to start writing your narrative until your characters feel real to you. That is very important. They must feel like real people in your mind before you can make them sound natural within a story. Continuing here with the outline, once you begin outlining your plot, okay, you're focusing on your story events. You're just taking it step by step, chapter by chapter. And again, I'll show you an example of that in a moment here. I would say consider including a prologue. It's not absolutely necessary, but sometimes it's nice to have that little prologue, maybe just 3 or 4 pages long, which hints at where the story is headed. I like to do either a flashback or a flash forward, not something that's directly in the same timeline, but it's just a flashback or a flash forward that kind of hints about where the story's headed. Okay, next, like I already said, you're going to break the events down chapter by chapter, and you don't have to have a certain number of chapters in mind ahead of time. Just let that develop naturally and see how many chapters you end up with. Just let it develop naturally. Don't say, oh, I'm going to write a 12-chapter book, because then that's just going to be more challenging. Just let it develop. Okay, make sure that you find a balance between being detailed and leaving some room for flexibility. The reason I'm stressing that is because if you lack details, then obviously you're going to struggle along the way. But at the same time, if your outline is super detailed, it actually makes it more challenging because you almost feel like you've already written the story. So just find that balance to where you know where you're headed, but you can be flexible along the way to sort of play around with the plot, especially the subplots a little bit. And by the way, definitely consider having some subplots. If you have some supporting characters that you think are interesting, make sure that something's going on with them. Give them a little something to do. Give them an arc as well. Okay, and then finally here, make sure that you have a strong conclusion which addresses the theme, and you don't have to beat the audience over the head with the theme. You know, trust that they are intelligent and that they can figure out what the message is, and then also they should be allowed to interpret what the meaning is. I know with some of my novels, I kind of left it somewhat open for the audience to make up their mind about what the story really meant. Now, some people don't like that. Some people like everything spelled out for them. But just me personally, I'm not a fan of doing that. In fact, the first ebook that I published, I know a lot of people were like, well, that was really the ending. And I'm like, yes, the story was really done to me at that point. And I left it open to interpretation. And I like some stories like that. But there are some other stories I've done where I did put more of a bow on the end of the story. So just be flexible about that, and you decide how much you really want to point out the theme in the end. But I would say you don't have to beat the audience over the head with it. Here is an example of an outline, and this is not a real outline that I'm using. This is just something I made up for this presentation. So you see I have some possible titles here, just thinking about the concept. Love what you do, opportunity knocks, regrets, and then you see love is not a game. And the reason that I have this one highlighted in a different color is because I went back and added this one as I was playing around with some other ideas. Okay, so just be willing to go back and forth and add in details where you need to. So this basic concept here you see is summed up in 2 sentences. It says Dennis has just reconnected with an old friend, Sarah, who he secretly had a crush on, but he's also been offered his dream job in another state. He has just 2 weeks, notice that's setting a time frame there. He has just 2 weeks to decide what's most important, love or his career. So that's just a basic, simple concept. Next here for the setting, you see how simple this is. I just made up the name of a town, Hawthorne, and then I said a laid-back small southern town where Dennis and Sarah grew up. And that's it, because I would just play along with those details as I'm doing the writing. But you do want to have just a basic idea of the setting. Next here with the characters, I'm not going to read all these off. You can just pause if you want to and take a look at these. But you see what I'm basically doing with these is I start off with an age. That tends to help me out. And then a quick description of their physical traits. Then get into their personality. And also, like I said, how they relate to the plot. So with the main character, Dennis here, I said he works at his parents' convenience store during the day and works on independent video games in his spare time. Okay, so that's just setting up what his career path is that he wants to take and what his current life is like, which you would imagine him working at his parents' convenience store, being 24 years old. He's probably not that happy with what's going on in his life right now. He wants to change. So it's really about a choice there that he would have to make in this story. Also, I threw in this character Lance here just to be basically a sort of add some conflict into this story if I were to write this story. But again, this is just an example. But setting up that possible antagonist there. And it says that he's a former high school jock, never paid Sarah any attention before, but likes the way she looks now. So he's kind of has his eye on her, and also he has a cooler job as well. He does custom car jobs, okay, automotive jobs. So like I said, just setting up an antagonist there as a possibility. Continuing with the example here, and again, this is not complete. This is just starting off showing you how things would go. As an epilogue, I said Dennis reminisces on playing a video game with Sarah on a day in which he almost tried to kiss her, but chickened out. So that epilogue would just set up his attraction to Sarah, and then it could, play out from there. And then with chapter 1, it jumps to present day, so I'm giving myself an idea of where we are in this story's timeline. And then just quickly, the events of what happens on that day. And what I tend to do within chapters, I tend to try to make sure that the events do happen in just one day. That's just something that I prefer. It makes it a little bit easier for me, maybe 2 days at the most. I try not to do a time jump within a chapter. I think that's kind of confusing for the reader. But again, I'm not going to read this all for you. You can pause if you want to and take a look here and see just basically how I plan this out, and notice it's not super detailed because I'm trying to leave some room for flexibility there. Next up here, writing your draft. I strongly suggest that you do it, focus on first person point of view. That means that your main character is the narrator. So the main character is doing the speaking to the reader. I think that's the easiest way to go about it, and it just feels more immediate. It's more easier to connect to that character. Next, use dialogue as much as possible, and here's a big tip for you. Make sure that you read your dialogue aloud to make sure that it sounds natural. Now it might make you feel a little bit silly to do that, to read aloud to yourself, especially if it's a conversation and you're reading both parts of it. But I really think you have to do that to make sure that the dialogue sounds natural. And again, use as much dialogue as possible because narration gets boring really quick if it's page after page after page of narration. Like I said, that can get boring, so try to include as much dialogue as possible. Also, get into dialogue as soon as you can. Okay, if in fact, I would suggest, at least with your first chapter, start off with dialogue and then take it from there, set the scene, and then continue on with the conversation and what's happening. Some other tips here: if you're having trouble staying focused with your writing, just set a schedule for yourself. Now, me personally, that's not something I tend to do, but if that's what you need to do, set a schedule for yourself. Also, it says here, allow someone you trust to read as you write. That's going to give you that feedback that you need to make some changes along the way, and also it puts some pressure on you because if the person is enjoying what they're reading, then they're going to keep asking for that next chapter, and that's going to drive you forward. That's a big motivation. I know that really helped me with the first ebook that I did. Next here it says, edit as you go along, but realize that most of your editing will be done after your draft is complete. So edit, 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 and then edit some more. I know I've gotten to the point where if I really want to, I can sit down and write a first draft of a novel in about a month to a month and a half. But then I spend a long time editing. In fact, my first ebook, I wrote it in, I believe, a month or a month and a half or so, about in that window. But then I edited it for over a year. I went back and just kept working with it. And this wasn't like constantly editing, but I would come back to it from time to time and just keep on working with it. So editing is really where your main work is done. It's not even that first draft. Editing is where most of your work is done. And keep finding ways to make your writing more interesting. Okay, and it says here, include more details, include some foreshadowing, also do some callbacks, and just find ways to make basically everything gel together in an interesting way. Play with it as much as you need to make it all feel seamless, okay, and just to make it more interesting for the reader. With your final draft, make sure you reread your novel several times, making changes as needed. Okay, but do be sure to think about how, when you make those changes, how they will affect the rest of your narrative. You don't want to play with details too much because it's sort of like pulling a string on a sweater. You know, you pull too hard, things are going to start to fall apart. So just be careful about that and keep track of the changes that you are making. And again, get feedback from someone else that you trust. I would not use the same person. I would go with somebody else because once it's a complete draft, it's really a different product altogether. So I would let somebody else check it out. And again, somebody that you trust, preferably somebody that's not a writer themselves, so you don't have to worry about somebody trying to steal your ideas. And then once your novel is complete, just decide how you want to get it out there. Do you want to publish your work? Now, like I said, I just focus on ebooks. I learned some things about the publishing world that I'm not a fan of. I noticed that it's a lot more about page count and word count than content. And that's just not cool with me personally. So that's why I have stuck with doing ebooks. And if you didn't know, self-publishing an ebook is free with Amazon KDP, and KDP stands for Kindle Direct Publishing. So anybody can get published and share your work if you want to, as long as you do the work. And you can follow up, go to Amazon KDP, check out basically what they expect from people with their writers, what sort of deal they cut with you, and all those sorts of things. Just follow up on that. Again, Amazon KDP. I'm not going to speak for them. You can just check that out if you're interested in doing ebooks. And that's really a big part of the publishing world now. A lot of people are into ebooks. Even well-known authors also do ebooks on the side. Books that don't get picked up by major publishers. They just self-publish them as ebooks. So this video, it actually is going on longer than I thought it would. I know this is kind of a lengthy video, but I really hope that this is helpful to you. I wish you the best with your writing. If you're really serious about writing, just realize it is going to take some work, and just write, write, write. That's all it's about. Do the work and it will pay off for you. Again, I wish you the best with your writing. If you have any questions of me, if you just want some feedback with your work, I'm here for you. You all take care.